He removed her sack and froze, the truth about the girl they called too ugly to marry. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked earth of Halcyon Ridge, a small, dusty town on the edge of the frontier. It was a place where men came to escape their pasts and women stayed hidden behind closed doors. It wasn't much, but to the folks who lived here, it was home, and nothing ever changed. Not until Darren arrived. Darren wasn't like the others. His clothes were worn and his boots caked with dust, but there was something about his eyes, a haunted look that suggested he had seen more of the world than most men. His past was his secret, and he didn't care to share it with anyone. He wasn't here for fame or fortune. He just needed to keep moving, to put the past behind him. But something about this town felt different. As he rode into Halcyon Ridge, the town was alive with whispers. People turned their heads as he passed, curious but cautious. New faces weren't common, especially not in a place like this. Darren didn't mind the stares. He didn't expect much from a town like this anyway. He made his way to the saloon, the only place where you could get a drink without asking too many questions. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, and the low hum of conversation buzzed in the background. A few men sat at the bar, but the real action was in the far corner, where a small group of locals were gathered around a table, talking in hushed tones. Darren approached the bar, nodding to the bartender, a thin man with a quick smile but a wary eye. Darren ordered a whiskey, his first drink in days. As the bartender poured it, Darren couldn't help but overhear the conversation at the table. They were talking about her. The girl with the sack, one man muttered, his voice low. The one they say is too ugly to marry, another man added, his tone full of judgment. Darren raised an eyebrow but said nothing, taking his drink in one swift gulp. He had heard of people like this, those who shunned anyone different, anyone who didn't fit their narrow view of the world. But a girl? Too ugly to marry? He found himself intrigued. It wasn't often that rumors about someone caught his attention, but there was something about this one that stirred a curiosity deep within him. What kind of girl would be so different that people would go out of their way to avoid her? Darren decided he would find out for himself. That evening, as the last traces of daylight slipped away, Darren rode out to the outskirts of town. He followed the dirt road, the sound of his horse's hooves the only noise in the quiet night. He didn't know why he was doing it. He just had to see for himself. He reached a small cabin at the edge of the town, tucked away from prying eyes. A dim light flickered from the inside, casting long shadows on the ground. Darren dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby post before approaching the door. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the empty night. There was a moment of silence, and then the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway, her face hidden beneath a large, tattered sack that hung from her shoulders. Darren couldn't make out her features, but something about her presence made him pause. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. It wasn't the voice of someone who had been rejected. It was steady, calm, as if she had accepted her fate and didn't need anyone's pity. "I heard about you," Darren said, his voice low. "I've heard people say things about you." "I'm sure you have," she replied, her tone almost like she had heard it all before. "Most people say a lot of things." "What's your point?" Darren wasn't sure what to say. He had expected more of a reaction, some hint of anger or sadness. But she stood there, still, waiting for him to speak. "I just want to know who you are," Darren said. "What's the story behind the sack?" The woman sighed, stepping aside to let him in. "If you want to know," she said, her voice softening, "then come inside. But understand, this isn't something you can unsee." Darren hesitated for only a moment before stepping through the door. The cabin was small, with a single bed tucked into the corner and a small fire crackling in the hearth. It smelled of wood and earth, a place where someone lived simply but didn't lack for anything essential. A pot, adjusting the pot hanging over it. "I'm Alara," she said, her back still to him. "I don't expect you to believe me, but I don't care either." Darren stood there, unsure of what to say. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. "I'm just curious," he said after a long pause. "Why the sack?" "What's the story?" Alara finally turned to face him. The sack she wore was draped over her head and shoulders, but now she pulled it back, revealing her face. At first, Darren froze. Her features weren't what he had expected. Her skin was pale, almost too pale, and her face bore the marks of something unnatural, like she had been scarred by something beyond her control. Her eyes were the color of the sky at dusk, bright and piercing, but there was something else about her, something deep and old, like the weight of the world rested behind her gaze. She was not ugly. She was different, yes, but not in the way the townsfolk had claimed. Elara saw the shock in Darren's eyes and gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's not what you think," she said quietly. "It never was, but people will always see what they want to see." Darren didn't know what to say. He had thought he would find a victim, someone who was broken and scared. But Elara wasn't broken. She was strong in her own quiet way, carrying the burden of her own truth. "I don't understand," Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do they call you ugly?" Elara's eyes softened and she looked away for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "They don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. "But you're not from here, so I'll tell you. I was created. Not born, not in the way you think. And when they saw what they had made, they decided I was too much of a mistake to be loved." Darren's heart twisted. He didn't know what she meant, but he didn't need to. The pain in her voice told him everything. "Created?" he asked, confused. "By who?" Elara didn't answer right away. She just turned back to the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the pot. "It's a long story," she finally said, "and you're not ready to hear it." But Darren was already hooked. Something told him he couldn't walk away now. Not from her, and not from the strange, haunting truth she was hiding. The next day, Darren couldn't stop thinking about Elara. The image of her face, scarred yet strong, stayed with him long after he left her cabin. He hadn't expected to feel sympathy for someone who seemed so different, but there was something about her, something raw and honest, that made him feel like he had to know more. It was early morning when Darren found himself once again standing at the edge of Elara's cabin. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if it was the right thing to do, but he couldn't stay away. He needed answers. As he knocked on the door, the familiar sound of Elara's soft voice called from within, "Come in." He opened the door and stepped inside, greeted by the warm, comforting scent of wood and fire. Elara was sitting by the hearth, stirring the pot with slow, deliberate movements. She didn't look up as Darren entered, but there was a sense of calm in the air, as though she was expecting him. "I didn't mean to intrude again," Darren said, his voice low. "But I can't stop thinking about what you said, about being created. I need to understand more." Elara finally looked up, her eyes meeting his. They were quiet, thoughtful eyes, as though she was weighing something inside. "You're not from here," she said softly. "You don't understand the way things work in this town. People talk, and they judge. They see what they want to see, not what's real." Darren sat down across from her, his curiosity burning like a fire he couldn't ignore. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Why are they so afraid of you?" Elara's face softened, and she stared into the fire, her fingers still gently turning the wooden spoon in the pot. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Darren waited patiently, sensing that this was something she didn't share lightly. Finally she spoke. "I was part of a project. A long time ago, before I came here, they wanted to create something perfect. Someone who could be controlled. I wasn't supposed to be born like others." Darren's mind raced, trying to understand. "Controlled? By who?" "The people who run this town," Elara replied, her voice tinged with a mixture of sadness and anger. "They wanted to breed the perfect woman, someone who could serve them, someone who would fit their idea of beauty, of perfection. But things didn't go as planned." Her words hit Darren like a punch to the gut. He had heard stories of people being manipulated for profit, but this was different. This wasn't just greed. It was cruelty, designed to strip away everything that made someone human. "I don't understand," Darren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What happened?" Elara stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the horizon. "They didn't care about me. Not really. They wanted to create a machine, not a person. They injected me with chemicals, altered my DNA, and tried to make me into something perfect. But the experiment didn't work. I wasn't perfect. I became something else. Something they couldn't control." Darren's heart sank. He had no words to say. He could only imagine the pain she must have felt, knowing she was the result of someone's cruel plan, a living experiment in the name of perfection. Elara's gaze never left the horizon, as though she could see the past in the setting sun. When they saw the results, they abandoned me, left me to die in the wilderness. But I survived. I came to this town, and I've been hiding ever since. Darren swallowed hard, his mind spinning with questions. "But why the sack? Why hide yourself from everyone?" Elara finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Because they told me I was too ugly to be seen. They said I wasn't worthy of love. The townspeople, people like you, wouldn't accept me. I had no choice but to hide. They wouldn't have understood. They would have judged me without ever trying to understand. Darren sat there, stunned by her words. How could anyone do that to a person? How could they treat someone as if they were less than human, just because they didn't fit some narrow idea of what was beautiful? "I'm sorry," Darren finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't imagine what you've been through, but I can't believe it. You're not ugly. You're not what they say you are." Elara's eyes softened, but her expression remained guarded. "It doesn't matter what you believe. What matters is what they believe, and I've learned to live with it. I've learned to accept it." Darren stood up, unable to sit any longer. The weight of her story was heavy on him, pressing down like the endless sky above. "I don't think I can just accept it," he said, his voice fierce. "Not when I know the truth. Not when I know what they did to you." "And what will you do about it? You're just one man in a town full of people who don't care." Darren looked out the window, his mind already working, formulating a plan. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I won't just walk away. I can't. Not when you've been through all this." For a long moment, there was silence between them. Then Elara spoke again, her voice low but firm. "You don't understand, Darren. You don't know what they'll do if you stand up to them. These people have power. They control everything in this town, and they won't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatens their control." Darren met her gaze, determination in his eyes. "I don't care about their power. I care about you, and I care about what's right." Elara didn't say anything for a long moment. She seemed to be considering his words carefully, weighing the truth in them. Then slowly she nodded. "You're brave, Darren, but be careful. You don't know what you're getting into." Darren smiled softly, a small but genuine smile. "I've faced worse." And with that, he turned and walked out of the cabin, the door closing softly behind him. As he stepped into the cool night air, he felt a sense of resolve settle in his chest. Elara's story had changed everything. Now it was time to make sure the people of Halcyon Ridge knew the truth. They would learn what had been done to her, and they would pay for it. Darren couldn't shake the thoughts of Elara from his mind as he left her cabin. The weight of her words hung heavy on his chest. He had never thought much about the people in Halcyon Ridge, but now everything had changed. The town was no longer just a place to pass through. It was a place where injustice had taken root, and Elara had been its victim. As he walked back into the center of town, the streets seemed quieter than usual. The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky streaked with shades of purple and gold. It was the kind of evening when everything felt still, almost too still. But Darren knew that wasn't the case. Underneath the calm, a storm was brewing. He made his way to the saloon, his steps deliberate and steady. The wooden doors creaked as he pushed them open, and the familiar chatter of the locals filled the air. But today, Darren wasn't interested in small talk or a drink. He was here for something else. Answers. He spotted a group of men sitting at a table in the back, their heads bent low in conversation. They paused when they saw him, their eyes narrowing in suspicion. Darren didn't care. He was beyond their judgment now. He had a mission. Without hesitation, he walked over to the group. "I need to know more about the people who run this town," Darren said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, "the ones who've been controlling things from the shadows." One of the men, a stocky figure with a grizzled beard, leaned back in his chair, eyeing Darren with a mixture of amusement and caution. You've been asking about the girl, haven't you?" he said, his voice rough. The one with the sack. I've heard enough. I want to know who's really behind all this. Who's responsible for what happened to her?" The man's face hardened. "You don't want to go down that road, stranger. You have no idea what you're dealing with." Darren stood his ground, his eyes locked on the man's. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking for the truth." The man stared at him for a long moment before sighing, as if he had made a decision. "Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." He nodded to one of the other men, who stood up and motioned for Darren to follow him. They led him through the back of the saloon, where a narrow hallway led to a small, dimly lit room. The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with old, faded maps and papers. A large desk sat in the center of the room, and behind it a man was seated, his hands stippled together in front of him. Darren didn't recognize the man, but the look on his face told him everything he needed to know. This was the kind of person who made decisions without caring about the consequences. "Sit," the man said, his voice cold and commanding. Darren hesitated, then took a seat across from him. "I want to know about Elara," he said, his tone steady. and the people who did this to her. The man's lips curled into a thin smile, but there was no warmth in it. So you've been talking to her, have you? She's nothing but a mistake. A failed experiment. She was never meant to be anything more than a tool. And when she didn't work, we discarded her. Darren's fists clenched at the man's words, but he stayed calm. You don't get to talk about her like that. The man leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. I don't need your approval. The town needs control, and people like her, people who are different, can't be allowed to exist. We needed her to be perfect, and when she wasn't, we had no choice but to leave her behind. Darren's mind raced. He had suspected as much, but hearing it from the man's own lips only fueled his anger. Elara wasn't just a victim of a failed experiment. She was a victim of a system that valued power and control over humanity. Who are you? Darren asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile widened, but there was nothing friendly about it. I'm the one who ensures things stay in order, the one who makes sure no one like her can ever upset the balance. Darren's heart pounded in his chest. He knew this man was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was enough. He had learned what he needed to know. Elara was just a casualty in a much larger game, a game where power and control were the ultimate goals. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. I'm not done yet, he said, his voice cold. You may think you have control over this town, but I'm going to make sure the truth comes out. No one is going to ignore what you did to her. The man's expression darkened, but Darren didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the room, the weight of his decision settling on his shoulders. He couldn't let Elara's story go untold, and he wouldn't let the people responsible for her suffering get away with it. As Darren walked back to his cabin, the streets of Halcyon Ridge felt different. The air seemed heavier, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to change. Darren didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let the corruption continue. The sun had set completely now, leaving the town bathed in the pale light of the moon. Darren's thoughts turned back to Elara.
She had been through so much, but she hadn't given up. She had survived when they tried to break her.
And now, Darren was going to make sure she didn't have to face the darkness alone. When he reached the cabin, he found her sitting by the fire, her face calm but guarded. She didn't look up when he entered, but Darren could feel the weight of her silence. I know what they did to you, Darren said quietly. I know who's behind it, and I'm going to make sure they pay for it. Elara's eyes met his, and for the first time, Darren saw a flicker of hope in her gaze. You're not afraid? She asked, her voice soft. No, Darren said, shaking his head. I'm not afraid, and neither should you be. Then let's make sure they don't get away with it. Darren smiled, a small but determined smile. He didn't know how they were going to bring down the people who had hurt her, but he knew one thing. He wasn't backing down. The truth would come out, and together they would fight for what was right. The days that followed were filled with tension. Darren and Elara knew they had to act quickly. The people in power, those who had created Elara and discarded her when she didn't fit their mold, wouldn't let their secret slip away easily. They had too much to lose. Darren had gathered information, spoken to those in the town who were too afraid to speak out before. He learned that the men who controlled Halcyon Ridge were powerful, wealthy, and used fear to maintain their grip on the town. They controlled the economy, the law, and even the hearts and minds of the people. But Darren had something they didn't: the truth. One evening, as the moon rose high over the town, Darren sat across from Elara in her small cabin. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The quiet between them was heavy, but there was a new sense of purpose in the air. We need to bring everyone together, Darren said, his voice low but steady. The people need to hear what happened to you. They need to know what's really been going on here. Elara nodded, her gaze distant. But the people are scared, Darren. They'd been told that speaking out means death. They'd been fed lies for so long, they'd forgotten what it means to stand up for what's right. Darren's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. The people of Halcyon Ridge had lived under the rule of fear for too long. They had seen what happened to anyone who crossed the wrong people. But it was time for that to change. It had to. I know it's going to be hard, Darren said, but we don't have any choice. We need to show them that they don't have to be afraid anymore. Elara turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. And if they don't listen? She asked quietly. We make them listen, Darren replied without hesitation. We tell the truth. We show them who the real monsters are. Elara didn't speak for a moment, but her eyes softened. You're brave, Darren. But you have to know this isn't going to be easy. These men have power. They'll do whatever it takes to keep their hold on this town. Darren stood up, his eyes fixed on hers. Then we'll make sure they don't get the chance. The next morning, Darren set his plan into motion. He spent hours talking to the people of Halcyon Ridge, quietly spreading the word. It wasn't easy, and many were hesitant. But little by little, the truth began to spread. People began to realize that they weren't the only ones who had suffered at the hands of the powerful men in charge. They had been controlled and manipulated for so long, they had almost forgotten what it was like to have a voice. The town square was the heart of Halcyon Ridge. It was where the people gathered to talk, to shop, to meet their neighbors, and it was where the final confrontation would take place. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Darren stood in the center of the square, his heart racing. The people were gathering cautiously at first, then in greater numbers. Alara stood beside him, her face calm but determined. She had agreed to speak, to tell her story to the people, no matter the cost. Darren looked around at the crowd. Some faces were familiar, others were strangers, but they all had one thing in common: fear. Fear of the men who ran the town. Fear of the unknown. But Darren wasn't afraid anymore, and neither was Alara. The crowd fell silent as Alara stepped forward. She didn't wear the sack this time. Her face, though still marked by the scars of her past, was visible to everyone. She was no longer hiding. "People of Halcyon Ridge," she began, her voice steady but strong. "I am Alara, and I am here to tell you the truth. For years, you've been told lies. You've been told that people like me, people who don't fit into their perfect world, are not worth your time. But I'm not the one who is broken. The ones who've been lying to you are the ones who are broken." She paused, looking out over the crowd. Some people shifted uncomfortably, but others leaned in, listening intently. "They created me. I was not born. I was made. They tried to make me perfect, but I didn't fit into their mold. So they abandoned me, left me to die. But I survived." Alara's voice faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "And now I'm here to tell you that you don't have to live in fear anymore. The men who've controlled this town have lied to you. They've used you. And I will not let them control me or any of you any longer." A murmur spread through the crowd, some of the people looking at each other in disbelief, but Darren could see the change in their eyes. The spark of something, hope, was beginning to grow. "Stand with us," Darren called out, stepping forward to join Alara. "We have the power to change this town. We have the power to take back what's ours." The crowd was silent for a moment, but then, slowly, one by one, people began to speak up. "We're with you," a woman called out from the back. "We've had enough of them." "Tell the truth," another man shouted. "We're not afraid anymore." The people of Halcyon Ridge were waking up, realizing they no longer had to live in fear. Darren and Alara had given them the courage to stand up, to take back what had been stolen from them. But as the crowd began to grow louder, Darren saw a shadow move at the edge of the square. It was the men in power, the ones who had controlled everything for so long. They had heard the growing unrest, and now they were ready to fight back. A tall, lean man stepped forward, his face twisted with anger. "Enough of this," he growled. "You don't know what you're doing. You're playing with fire, and you'll burn this town to the ground." Darren stepped forward, his chest puffed out in defiance. "It's you who's been burning this town," he said, his voice cold. "And now it's time for it to end." A tense silence followed, the air thick with the promise of a showdown. But Darren wasn't afraid. He had the truth on his side, and now the people of Halcyon Ridge were standing with him. And that was all they needed. The town of Halcyon Ridge would never be the same. The corrupt leaders were overthrown, their grip on the town shattered. The people had reclaimed their power, and Alara, once the outcast, became a symbol of strength and resilience. Darren stood beside her as they looked out over the town. There was still much to be done, but for the first time in a long while, the future seemed full of possibility. Together, they had fought for freedom, and together, they had won.